Hello and welcome to the Foreverlocke Challenge explanation video. This video exists to help you understand what the challenge is, the basic rules of the challenge, as well as to outline how I will be performing the challenge myself over on twitch.tv/thelid77. This video assumes that you already have a general understanding of the Pokemon series, as well as knowing what a Nuzlocke is. If you're unfamiliar with what a Nuzlocke is in the context of Pokemon, I've left a link in the description that should give you a basic idea of how they work. With all of that said, let's start with the objective. The goal of the Foreverlocke challenge is to acquire one instance of every Pokemon in the National Pokédex and assemble them into one massive collection. However, in order to be applicable for this collection, the Pokemon must have survived a Nuzlocke challenge up until the credits roll in a playthrough of a main series Pokemon game. This is a long-term challenge that will take place across a series of back-to-back and repeated playthroughs of every mainline Pokemon game, with the ultimate goal being to get one of every single species of Pokemon to survive. In most cases, this means defeating the Pokemon League and entering the Hall of Fame. With this in mind, the Pokemon who clear the challenge will henceforth be referred to as Hall of Famers. Note that this collection includes every Pokemon, including each evolutionary stage individually. That means having a Bulbasaur that is separate from your Ivysaur and Venusaur, for example, with this idea applied across the entire National Pokédex. For that extra bit of challenge, regional variant Pokemon such as Alolan Vulpix or Galarian Mr. Mime will also count separately from their original counterparts. Alright, now that you know what a Foreverlocke is, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the rules of the Foreverlocke challenge. If you're using this video as a guide for your own attempt at the Foreverlocke challenge, bear in mind that you can feel free to alter aspects of the rules as is pertinent to you. With that said, Rule number 1. Fainting. As is standard in a Nuzlocke, if a Pokemon has its HP reduced to 0, it is considered dead and is no longer usable. It must be released as soon as possible, never to be used again. Note, if you're put into a position where a Pokemon that has died is auto-healed and forcibly sent into battle, you must let it take damage until it has fainted again, and it cannot attack if at all possible. Rule number 2. Catching and encounters. This is where things slightly deviate from the standard Nuzlocke. In the Foreverlocke challenge, you are permitted to catch any number of Pokemon in each area, as some games in the series encourage you to do so in order to progress, such as Pokemon Legends Arceus or Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. However, in each playthrough, only the first encounter you have in each in-game area is valid to become a part of your final collection or to be used in battle. Pokemon who are not your initial encounter must be released at the earliest possible opportunity. Incidentally, I define an area as the location listed on the Pokemon status screen as its met location. This means that places with multiple explorable environments, such as Pinwheel Forest, are counted as one large area. Additionally, it is worth noting that in games where random encounters in the grass are not the only means of discovering wild Pokemon, your first valid encounter becomes the first wild Pokemon to engage you in battle, or if possible, be caught outside of battle. Another thing to note is that if you're in an area where Pokemon can be caught, but Pokeballs have not yet been made available in that playthrough, this rule is ignored until you do have access to Pokeballs. Rule number 3. Gift and static Pokemon. Pokemon received via special circumstances in games are considered separate from the first wild Pokemon encounter for the area in which they are obtained. One example is gift Pokemon, such as the starter you receive at the beginning of your journey, the Togepi egg you receive in the Johto games, or the Eevee you receive in Celadon City. For instance, obtaining Piplup at Lake Verity counts separately from the Lake Verity encounter you could acquire later on. Another example of special circumstances are in-game event Pokemon encounters, commonly known as static encounters. These are any Pokemon who are predetermined to be in a particular location, such as legendary Pokemon. For instance, you may acquire a Mount Ember encounter, and then go on to additionally capture Moltres as a separate, fully usable encounter. This also applies to predetermined Pokemon like the Voltorb in New Mauville or Fungus on Unova's Route 6. However, any static Pokemon acquired in this way should be limited to once per species in any given playthrough. Additionally, Pokemon who roam the region such as Latias or Raikou are considered static encounters in the area in which they are initially found, and Pokemon inside of raid dens are also considered separate from that area's encounter, with a limit to one den per area in each playthrough. Rule number 4. Blacking/whiting out. If during your playthrough you have every member of your team's HP reduced to 0, that playthrough is a loss and subsequently ends. The challenge as a whole does not, but sadly you are not allowed to continue on that particular save file's journey. From there, you'll simply have to move on to the next playthrough. Rule number 5, the slot system. This system is arguably the most important aspect of the Foreverlocke challenge and is what allows the challenge to function in general. Similar to a standard Nuzlocke's duplicates clause or species clause, the slot system allows the player to bypass the need to catch Pokémon at specific times based on certain conditions. It works like this. Upon capturing a Pokémon, you must declare and record what slot you want that Pokémon to occupy, those slots being each of the evolutionary stages that Pokémon is capable of becoming. Once recorded, you may bypass an initial encounter in favor of another if that initial encounter does not have the potential to occupy an unfilled slot. Here's an example. If you encounter Caterpie on Route 2, and then declare it as your Caterpie slot, you're no longer in need of a Caterpie. However, you'll still have your Metapod and Butterfree slots left to fill, meaning that if you run into another Caterpie in Viridian Forest, you'll still need to catch it to fill those other 2 slots, since it's capable of achieving those forms. For another example, say that you encounter and capture a Poochyena as your initial encounter on Route 101, and then declare it will occupy your Mightyena slot. If later you then encounter a wild Mightyena, since you've already declared a Pokémon as your Mightyena slot, even though it hasn't become one yet, that encounter can be bypassed for a different initial encounter not already accounted for. Understanding and working with this rule and strategically picking which slots to fill and when is one of the most fun and important aspects of the challenge as a whole. Rule number 6, the storage bank system. This system is another rather fun aspect of the Foreverlocke challenge. Any Pokémon caught and stored in the PC for later use that did not go on to enter the Hall of Fame in a playthrough is to be transferred into what I call a storage bank, which is a save file of a game from the same generation that houses Pokémon between playthroughs. Upon the completion or loss of a playthrough, any Pokémon that remains in the PC is transferred into these storage banks. Then, the next time you play a game of the same generation, all the Pokémon in the storage bank can be transferred into the new playthrough for use. This can be done the old-fashioned way via trading with yourself, using applications like Pokémon Home for the Switch titles, or if you're emulating, by using online tools such as PKHeX. I'll have a video out very soon on how to use PKHeX for your Foreverlocke challenge, as it's the easiest method to perform the storage bank system. Additionally, you can also use this system to have your Pokémon hold items for you between playthroughs in games where items are able to be held by Pokémon, giving yourself that much more of an advantage where you can. Rule number 7, transferring Pokémon up. You may transfer Pokémon caught in earlier generations into the storage bank of a later generation if it's possible. Keep in mind, however, that doing so does limit the available Pokémon in the earlier generation, so exercise this freedom with caution. Pokemon caught in Generation 1 and 2 can transfer Pokemon that exist in both between one another's storage banks, as well as into your Generation 7 storage bank via the 3DS Virtual Console. Although Gen 2 sadly cannot transfer Pokemon up into Gen 3, it is possible to transfer Gen 3 Pokemon to Gen 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and 6 to 7 at your leisure. From Generation 8 on, Pokemon can be transferred from all previous gens so long as the Pokemon exists in the game that they're being transferred to. Also important to note, if a Pokemon is slotted as a Pokemon that does not exist in the generation it was caught in, at the time of its capture it must automatically be transferred to the earliest possible generation in which it can actually occupy that form. For example, if you capture a Duskull in Pokemon Ruby and declare it as your Dusknoir slot, it must then immediately be transferred to Generation 4 or higher, the generations where Dusknoir exists. Rule number 8, team locking. This rule exists as a means of adding yet another layer of challenge to the run. The way that it works is that, essentially, in any given playthrough, any Pokemon you decide to add to your party becomes a permanent fixture of the team. Switching out team members is prohibited, meaning that every single selection counts, with the player not able to use other Pokemon aside from those initially selected team members until those team members become Hall of Famers. Once they accomplish that goal, they are to be removed from the playthrough and stored in a storage bank that has been set aside specifically for Hall of Famers. It is important to note that once a Pokemon has become a Hall of Famer and cleared the challenge, that Pokemon is no longer usable in any playthrough after that point for any reason. Rule number 9, team requirements. This rule states that the Pokémon that encompass a player's team in a playthrough must have met a certain criteria in order to be added to the team in the first place. At any given time, 3 Pokémon on the player's team must be Pokémon who are slotted as Pokémon that are still capable of evolving. In other words, 3 of your Pokémon cannot be fully evolved when they enter the Hall of Fame. Additionally, one of those 3 must be slotted as a Pokémon who is capable of evolving twice. The other 3 team members can be of any evolutionary stage. This rule forces the player to adapt to using wide varieties of different evolutionary stages. Here are a few examples of possible team combinations. Rule number 10. Auto-adding. The third leg of the trifecta of team-based rules, this rule states that at any time you have a Pokémon available in your playthrough that meets the criteria of the Team Lock and Team Requirement rules that could be added to the team, it must be added to the team. With this idea in mind, the player must constantly be aware of what Pokémon they have available to them, and anytime a slot on the party opens up, they are required to fill that slot as quickly as possible. Rule number 11. Level caps. While the Foreverlocke challenge does not have a traditional level cap rule, it is generally encouraged that the player not overlevel their Pokémon. However, there is one scenario where a hard level cap must be adhered to, and that is to do with Pokémon transferred from previous playthroughs. These Pokémon cannot be used by the player until they've met one of 2 possible conditions. A previous playthrough Pokémon may not be used unless it is A, equal to or under the level of the highest level Pokémon acquired in the current playthrough, or B, equal to or under the level of the next upcoming gym leader, whichever is higher. This rule exists to prevent the player from sweeping through playthroughs with ease, using vastly overleveled Pokémon from their past playthroughs. These Pokémon won't be able to be added until later in the playthroughs, when their levels make more sense. The only exception to this rule is when the player has literally no choice but to add a Pokémon from the PC due to all possible early game Pokémon being fully accounted for already, meaning that they are permitted to use a single Pokémon from their PC that bypasses the level cap that is the lowest level possible until they have earned the right to use higher level Pokémon based on the previously mentioned criteria. Something important to note is that clearing the final gym eliminates the level cap, meaning that from that point forward, any level of Pokémon may be used. Another thing to note is that in games where there are no gym leaders, the gym leader rule applies to the closest possible equivalent, such as the totem Pokémon and Kahuna battles in the Alola region. Rule number 12. Challenge criterias. It'd be far too easy in a given playthrough to simply steamroll the game with a single, powerful Pokémon while 5 other less useful Pokémon are waiting in the wings to walk across the finish line at the end. To prevent this, and encourage the use of your entire team throughout the run, this rule exists. Essentially, in order for the player to be able to challenge each major battle in a playthrough, their entire team must be within 5 levels of difference from one another. This means grinding when necessary to ensure that the team is roughly on par with one another before tackling each major hurdle. Usually, these major battles would be events like challenging gym leaders and the Elite Four as a whole, or their closest respective equivalents in games where those events aren't factors, such as Legends Arceus. Rule number 13. No trading. Trading is not allowed in the Foreverlocke challenge. This includes trading with in-game NPCs. The only time trading of any kind is permitted is for the sake of quickly evolving a Pokémon who evolves by trade, such as Haunter or Seadra. Rule number 14. Post-game. The player is allowed to engage in post-game activities after the credits roll in any given playthrough. This can be a prime opportunity to catch legendaries, get the encounters of post-game exclusive areas, as well as pick up useful items. Keep in mind once again that the team members that became Hall of Famers in that playthrough are not permitted to be used while engaging in post-game activities, as they will have been transferred to your Hall of Fame storage bank already. Once the credits roll, you'll have to assemble a team from your PC, bearing in mind the previously mentioned team rules, to use in the postgame. All normal challenge rules remain in effect during the postgame, so tread carefully. Also, it's important to note that the player is prohibited from challenging the Elite Four a second time in the postgame. Only one team of Hall of Famers is permitted per playthrough. Once the player has had their fill of postgame activities, they have but simply to declare the end of the playthrough, and that playthrough ends. Rule number 15. HMs. HMs are a tricky thing to work into any Pokemon challenge run, but they are manageable. The Foreverlocke applies HM rules that are more or less the standard for Nuzlockes. If a Pokemon on the team can learn the HM that is required for progression, it must be taught that HM. If no team member has access to that HM, but a Pokemon in the PC does, the player may temporarily swap that HM user from the PC to be used for progression. If the player has no Pokemon at all that can learn the necessary HM, the player may then catch a wild Pokemon that is capable of learning it and use it to progress, releasing it at the earliest possible opportunity. Keep in mind that any Pokemon added to the team temporarily for this purpose should not be used in battle. If for some reason it is forced to, it should be switched out if possible or use only non-attacking moves. If somehow you find yourself in the unfortunate scenario where all of your normal team members faint and you're left with only the HM user, this is considered an instant loss even if you still have your normal team member waiting in the PC, so tread carefully with your temporary HM users and get them out of your party as soon as you can. Rule number 16. Mythical Pokémon. There are Pokemon whose availability is limited to special, in-the-moment event distributions from across the years. Many of these Pokemon are incredibly difficult to obtain, and thusly difficult to manage for this challenge. For my own run of the Foreverlocke challenge, I have implemented a ruling where for every 10 Hall of Famers I advance into the Hall of Fame storage bank, I am permitted to use the PKHeX application to generate a copy of an official event distribution mythical Pokemon as a reward. If one of these mythical Pokemon dies in a run, it will always be replaced by another copy of the same Pokemon at its original level, so that it isn't possible to run out of Hall of Famers before gathering every mythical Pokemon. However, how you decide to handle mythical Pokemon for your own challenge is up to your discretion. If you choose to simply omit mythicals entirely, that is a perfectly valid option. With all of that said, those are the rules of the Foreverlocke challenge. If you're confused or need clarification on one of the rules, I highly recommend joining the Foreverlocke Discord. In addition to being where I'm tracking all of my progress as I stream my own Foreverlocke challenge run, I have also provided handy resources, including more intricate details on the rules and things that can help you if you decide to take on the challenge for yourself. I have a lovely little community over there as well, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if you ask. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that the challenge intrigues you. Special thanks to my good friend and Twitch mod Dapper Kirby for helping with scripting for this video. Couldn't have done it without you. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you around. Take care!